Listening to the Oxford Global Society OXGS podcast with me, Brian Wong, an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong and a fellow at the Society. Professor Yuen Yuen Ang is a professor of political economy at Johns Hopkins University, and she's also an incredible thinker, writer, and academic with penetrating insights into the Chinese political economy, but also its broader comparative significance, and as well as, of course, with insights into institutional economics and development at large. He's the author of celebrated books, including China's Gilded Age, published in 2020, and How China Escaped the Poverty Trap, published in 2016. Yuen Yuen, it's an honor to have you here with us today.
It is equally my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, Brian.
Thank you. So I want to just start with a piece you wrote recently for Project Syndicate, How Exceptional is China's Crony Capitalist Boom? And I'd really recommend it to all of you listening back home, right? And now, Yuen Yuen, your argument appears to be a response to the almost oft-repeated mantra and conventional wisdom that China's growth appears to be exceptional because of the rampant corruption that occurred alongside the significant growth rates the country sustained. And in response to this narrative, you note that much of this fraught history, I quote, of the collusion between capitalists and politicians to accumulate vast wealth as new industries were forged, has been expunged from development economics. It's not mentioned in the so-called orthodoxy of development economics. Why is that? Does this have a tendency, or does this have to do with a tendency to conflate, what is legal with what is moral or acceptable by those working in the study of development economics? Or, what exactly is going on here?
Thank you very much for highlighting that piece, which is a re-articulation of my book, China's Gilded Age. And in that book, I ask a frequently, I address a frequently asked question: why has China's economy grown despite corruption? Right? The conventional wisdom is that corruption impedes growth, and Western industrialized democracies prospered precisely because they eliminated corruption and established good governance. So with that benchmark, right, with that point of reference, China looks puzzling because it doesn't conform to conventional wisdom. And my short answer to this question is, in fact, if the West had grown with corruption, why not China? Right? And so I'm actually using the case of China as almost like a foil to expose the myths that we have long held about the process and the nature of Western development, which is deeply embedded throughout our understanding of political economy.
But I wanted to jump in on this point, Yuen Yuen, because it strikes me that the methodological question here also matters, right? Yeah. When it comes to tracking instances of legalized access money, as you talked about in the article in your book, the idea that you essentially have de jure permitted, usages of funds and money that in practice serve a very narrowly defined or almost, exert a distortionary effect on the way politics plays out. Do you think it's challenging to capture and measure capitalist influence over governments, especially in drawing the line between what is permissible and what is actually useful versus what is destructive and also, an impediment to democracy, so to speak, kind of access money? Is that a methodological issue you had to tackle in your works, and how did you seek to overcome the hurdle there?
Yeah, that's a great spot-on question. It's both a historical question as well as a measurement question. So I would begin by saying that conventionally, we think that the story of capitalism is one about, as countries become richer, they eliminate corruption. So conventionally, that's what we believe. And indeed, if you look at corruption rankings and you correlate them with income levels, it's very clear that rich countries have very low levels of corruption, while poor countries have a lot of corruption. The real history of capitalism, I argue, is actually a different and more subtle one, which is that it isn't necessarily the case that as countries get richer, they eliminate corruption, but rather that corruption evolves in quality, right? They evolve away from theft and thuggery and illegal actions into sophisticated exchanges of power and wealth. And these kinds of actions often become legalized and institutionalized. And when I say institutionalized, what I mean is in an act of extortion, for instance, it's very clear that these are the bad guys involved. We can point to particular individuals. But when you have institutionalized corruption, like financial secrecy that in turn funds various other kinds of unscrupulous activities, you may find that at the end of the day, no individual is corrupt, but the whole network and the whole institution has been corrupted. So the evolution of capitalism, I argue, is actually toward the sophistication of corruption and not necessarily the elimination of it. And from that perspective, when we look at China today, I would argue that it is actually a relative newcomer compared to the Western experience. It has many more similarities to the Western capitalist path than most people think. And I have used the American Gilded Age as my point comparison. What we see in the American experience is that in the late 19th century, during the Gilded Age, when America was a developing country, it was rapidly growing and industrializing. It in fact had a tremendous amount of corrupt deals and corruption. But over time, what happened was that the growth impeding kinds of corruption, like embezzlement, extortion, was steadily brought under control, whereas elite collusion was not necessarily eliminated, but it evolved into what is now known as lobbying. So that was the real American evolutionary story. And what we see in China today is an early replication of that process. If you look at both the article and in my book, I show one graph where it's very clear that in the 1990s, China's main form of corruption was embezzlement and misuse of public funds. Because back in those days, even though China is an authoritarian regime, it had low state capacity. It actually was unable to monitor most of its bureaucrats effectively. So there were a lot of leakages of public funds. And bribery at the time was actually relatively low in the 1990s. Because in order to have vibrant bribery activities, you actually need to have a vibrant economy at the same time. But fast forward 20 years later, you see that the patterns of corruption completely reversed. By the 2000s, China's main form of corruption was graft, whereas embezzlement was dramatically brought under control by a program of administrative modernizing reforms that started in the 1990s.
On that note, I wanted to jump in on the status quo here in China, because it strikes me if we look at the past sort of, decade or so under the incumbent leader, so to speak, China, at the very least, certain efforts have been made by the incumbent leadership, or so it seems, to crack down on or legally perhaps root out, even though it's done selectively and even if selectively, on access money and on the kind of graft that had been so problematic for the party's relationship with the people and causing a serious credibility deficit, so to speak. Now, some folks have said this is a politically motivated campaign. Others would say, that it isn't the case that everything's getting paid. and it's rather selective in terms of the trends. But on one hand, I'm seeing this in China, and then on the other hand, I think the US hasn't really reined in on lobbying, super PACs, money politics, and also, it's almost as if the US has opted to institutionalize, legalize, and thereby normalize, the phenomenon of access money. So my question for you, Yuen Yuen, is: do you think this is a fair reading, or maybe is this oversimplistic? And furthermore, what are the explanations for the path divergence between China and the US on this front in terms of leadership incentives, or is it something more fundamental to do with, the economic structures and the industries either of these countries or both of them are supporting right now?
You brought up, you implied a good point, which is that when we make comparisons between China and the US, it is important to realize that they have similarities, but it doesn't mean they're identical. We must be mindful of the similarities and the differences at the same time. And while I have said that China, in many ways, it has partially replicated the first half of the American path, there are still sharp differences between them as the result of political regime type where they would never converge. And one of these ways is lobbying. Lobbying is not corruption by itself. It is not. Lobbying is actually democratic representation, right? And that is why it is something so difficult to grapple with, because you cannot take away democratic representation. It's an essential part of democracy that any group has the right to intervene in the policy process, to influence, to make itself heard, to influence policymakers in their favor. Any group can do that. Even universities can do that. Nonprofits do that too. The difficulty in democracies is that lobbying becomes a problem when it is clearly an unequal playing field. When some groups have pockets that are so deep, connections that are so powerful, that they end up dominating the policy decision-making process at the expense of society at large. So we can think, for example, efforts to block climate action, right? But the difficulty here, which really boils down to the fact that corruption of the rich is so difficult to pin down, is because it is ambiguous.
Yes.
Right? Lobbying by itself is not wrong. Now, when you look back at China, I do not think that China would ever develop and institutionalize lobbying the way it is done in America, because in China, power is highly personalized, right? So if there's any form of effort to influence, it's always about individual activities, right? So personal ties between an official and his client. Whereas in a mature democracy like the United States, that influence politics takes the form of organizations, like entire organizations are involved in this process rather than individual. You can almost say that in America, that process is corporatized, right? So it's corporates are heading that process. Whereas in China, it would remain personal because of the different political structures.
That's a fascinating point, and I don't mean to sort of challenge that claim, but I do have a thought that came to my mind, which is essentially to do with tech regulation and the reining in of big tech in China. So the recent work by a colleague of mine, Angela Zhang, the high wire details in a very detailed manner, the story of how regulators, party leadership, large tech firms and consumers, this four-tier structure and hierarchy of sorts of individuals interacting with one another. And a fascinating point that she raises is the amount of sort of lobbying by these firms, these big tech businesses, through hiring retired bureaucrats, especially mid-tier administrators, through sending in representatives and delegates at the CPPCC and the NPC, especially the former, which is a United Front organ, through all sorts of, infiltration or percolation through bureaucratic apparatuses. There's almost this sort of, political lobbying without necessarily money politics, but it's more an employment of political status and perceived loyalty, not in a personalistic sense, but in a bureaucratic fashion, to achieve pretty much the same effects as, I guess, big money and powerful donors and PACs, currently accomplish their ends in American politics. And I guess that also feeds into, more generally speaking, inter-bureaucratic contestation and what some might describe to be sort of lobbying PACs formed by the associates of these large bureaucracies. So the case in point, of course, is essentially, we look at COVID and how different bureaucracies jostled for power and control over public health policies. You had more, the state security, the Public Security Bureau obviously took a very sort of almost austere lens through lenses of law and order and enforcement of compliance with quarantine restrictions on one hand, and then you also had the economic regulators, folks at MOFCOM or in thuggery saying, well, maybe, hold on, this is not how we should approach, the factories, right? What about small and medium businesses? What about their interests? So I guess there is an element of inter-bureaucratic politics that radiates through lobbying and reflects the results of lobbying. But of course, that is an aside, so to speak, and I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on that point. Alongside, I guess, the question I have for you, though, is, when I'm reading your work, I feel like as a political theorist myself, much of the work you do is not just empirical, it's also interpretive. Because at the end of the day, in drawing a line between freedom of speech and expression and the ability to form PACs and platforms and donate on one hand versus crossing that line and really entering into a domain and territory of corruption, that to me is a normative line drawing exercise. It's almost like you're saying, this is justified, this is not. And do you ever, find yourself struggling with figuring out where do you draw the line? Do you look at the effects of the money? Do you look at the inequality between the wealthiest donors and the poorest or indeed non-existent donors? I mean, how do we, express and capture this complex phenomenon that's often so murky through precise terms, in your opinion?
Oh, I love that comment. I do struggle with that. I do struggle with that in exactly the way you described, because I was trained as an empiricist. So I'm comfortable with things like I can measure corruption, and then I can test the hypothesis, and I'm only talking about facts, right, and evidence. But as my work developed further, I came to realize that there's no such thing as pure empiricism. All empirics at the end of the day is premised on some amount or a lot of normative assumptions. And corruption happens to be the best example, because it ultimately is a very moralizing topic. Like, what is corruption, right? What is improper? What is unethical? What counts as abuses of power? That necessarily has to be a moral argument, right? About what individuals can do, about what politicians can or cannot do. And so, yes, when I was, as I was working on both the China Gilded Age book and subsequently in a more comparative and historical project, I realized that in order to crack these puzzles we have about the relationship between corruption and development, I actually have to head on address the question of what do we mean by corruption? And as I've argued, the forms evolve over stages of development. And when you get into rich countries, you start to enter highly ambiguous and contested normative grounds about should this be counted as corruption? Is this access money? So yes, I struggle with it all the time, but I think what I'm trying to do is to make that struggle part of the collective conversation, because it's not my struggle, right? I think everyone should struggle with it, particularly now that we see a democratic crisis in Western democracies. And that crisis of confidence is not because of bribery or extortion. It's not because of corruption of the poor, but it's because of a widespread public perception that the system is rigged. Right? You have extreme inequality. The extremely rich are also extremely influential. Like the public doesn't fully understand the mechanisms, but they have a very vivid sense of the unfairness. And that's why populist autocrats can leverage that sentiment of unfairness and anger to get themselves into power. So I think what I'm grappling with is not something I'm doing on my own. I think that now is actually a unusually ripe moment to question the long-held myths that we've always had about corruption, development, democracy. The glorified idea that the West was unique in creating prosperous free markets, good governance. We know that clearly is not the case today, right? Neoliberalism is being questioned. Democracy itself is in crisis. And I think that if we can come to terms with the fact that the history had always been distorted, the narratives had always been twisted, then we are much less shocked and disturbed by what we see today.
I study post-colonial transitions and also historical injustices. And when reading your works, a term that kept coming up, or rather a question that kept coming up, was Spivak's question, can a subaltern speak? In our adopting narratives that say, well, the West had great practices, just institutions, not entirely wrong, rule of law, all of that. Speak of these great, almost like the gardens of the universe or the world. We're also, as if we're neglecting, surely on the other hand, the basis upon which, and the backs of the individuals on which the garden was built, which is the backs of the slaves in the transatlantic slave trade, millions, hundreds of millions living in, the British Raj, the Indian subcontinent, in Africa and Latin America, that fueled Western empires. And I suppose, the question I'd love to ask those who argue that the West equals best practices is, well, what about the best practices and also the absence of extractive and the availability of inclusive institutions for those living in the colonies? I mean, surely they were entitled to the inclusive institutions and also the rule of law and the protections as well, but they were not granted these protections in practice. So how can we reconcile, colonialism and historical subjugation of vast swaths of the Earth's population with this sort of almost Panglossian vision of Western successes in building up just and proper institutions? I don't know what you make of this.
I use a quote from the American historian Richard White. He says, "In success as much as in failure, the modern world is made." I think we've reached a point where we need to look back and deeply question this overly rosy view of modernization, which we instinctively, as you very eloquently describe, equate with progress. Only progress is only success. It only gets better and better. And increasingly, as I get older, and as my work matures, I realize that we have to recognize that modernization was always a mixed outcome. That is true in the West, and it is true in China today.
Good.
But we don't hear about modernization as a mixed outcome because victors write history and victors write political economy. So the countries that modernize first, they craft a narrative of we modernized and grew and became successful because of all of these wonderful things we did. Now, as you pointed out, let's be very clear. The West really did accomplish many good things, raising material standards of living, eventually establishing liberal democracies. The fact that today women and minorities can attempt to carve out a space for themselves in democracies are all signs of progress. But as you also pointed out, that inclusiveness, particularly in the beginning, was only for wealthy white men. And it was only gradually extended over time through tremendous contestation and struggle, right? And the context of corruption is really ideal for understanding this process. Because when you look at the stories of corruption that took place in the American Gilded Age, it was very clear that what really happened is that these tycoons who became tremendously rich practiced exclusion privately and urged everyone to have free market competition. Right? So it was double standards at work, right? That helped to make them rich, right? So friends for themselves, free market competition for everyone else. So I think we need to make a very clear distinction between the historical reality, which is always mixed and fraud, versus the narratives that are told, versus the narratives that people may prefer to hear. History is powerful if you take it seriously. If you take the fraud facts seriously, they will open your eyes.
And of course, whilst Western political economists, or some, have a tendency to portray China's story as almost very exceptional, very exquisite, and almost exotic. On that question, I want to pivot to a slight tangent to this conversation, which concerns Singapore. Because I'm looking at the performance of Singapore in both of the graphs included in China's Gilded Age and your Project Syndicate article. And across both fronts of access and speed money, Singapore appears to be fairly consistently non-corrupt, so to speak, whilst retaining a high GDP per capita on a graph. And I was just wondering, would you say, Yuen Yuen, that Singapore is an exceptional country?
Well, I have contested the assumption of Chinese exceptionalism. Yes, I would argue that Singapore truly is exceptional. It is exceptional, number one, in its very, very small size, which means that if you have a good leadership, that leadership has the geographical conditions to make sure that his vision is totally implemented. You can't do that in China or the United States with so much heterogeneity. So first of all, Singapore is very small. Now, secondly, Singapore is also exceptional because of its leadership. The founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, I'm not sure what the word is. I think formative is still too light a word. He really imprinted his philosophical DNA deeply into both government and society. And had Singapore not had a leader like him, we would not have the outcome that we see today. Let's be very clear about that. The effects of his leadership were profound, right? He is a leader on the scale of Deng Xiaoping, right? Except Deng Xiaoping was governing a gigantic country, and Lee Kuan Yew ruled a very small island state. And so I've named only two conditions, but these two conditions are at least enough to kind of help us understand the exceptionalism that we see in Singapore, right? Including the policy of paying civil servants generously, right, to eliminate corruption, including the very strong ethos of zero tolerance of any form of illegal corruption, right, in the country. The implementation is thorough, right? So I would say in those respects, it is exceptional. But when you look at China, on the other hand, of course, China is exceptional in many, many ways. Its history, its one-party political system. But when you put it side by side with the United States, they share a number of similarities that I think most people never think about. One of which is that both of these societies, China after Mao and the US after the Civil War, were gigantic emerging economies that rebuilt after complete devastation, right? So you had this exceptional opportunity of a gigantic burst of growth, right? If you can get things right. But this process of growth, as I show in my work, was of course also fraught with collusion.
You know, the anchoring question of our series grapples with the purported relationship between democracy and development. And as we all know, some economists, so Acemoglu and Robinson, you know, they've advocated that politically and economically inclusive institutions are in the long term necessary, or even if not necessary, vastly conducive towards economic growth. Others are more skeptical of the involvement, indeed, of even technocratic bureaucrats and so-called experts in growth. So Bill Easterly, for instance, lambasts the excessive involvement or the sort of weighing and reliance upon the testimony of experts in driving governmental policies. And yet, in how China escaped the poverty trap, you highlighted a complex bundle of interactive factors: stability, pragmatic and adaptive governance, a vibrant private entrepreneurial sector, and constructive international relations and environments like that share equally important role when it comes to economic growth. So my question for you here is, from a big picture point of view, zooming out here, democracy, growth, development, three different things, especially democracy and growth. How should we make sense of the causal relationship between these concepts, and do they interact?
I would highlight some of the following. The first thing that I would say is that we need to distinguish between the intrinsic value of democracy and its potential function in growth promotion. Okay? And I think one of the problems with democracy promotion in the West is that democracy is being promoted for its supposed extrinsic benefits, right? Which is the argument that democratic nations are more likely to prosper, right? And so what Why Nations Fail tells you is, if you have inclusive and non-extractive institutions, which is just a different way of saying democracy, then you will succeed, right? You will have power, you will have wealth. So that's really selling people democracy in the way you would say, why don't you marry me because I have a Mercedes, right? You know, I have these trappings of wealth and power and success, right? So, you know, you should do democracy because it will give you wealth and power and success. So that's really the narrative that's been sold, right, for the past 50 years or so. And particularly after the end of the Cold War, that just seems so compelling, right? Because America was both super rich and super and democratic, right? So that's why Fukuyama called it the end of history, right? The conclusion is done, right? And I think that that's a really flawed way of advocating for democracy, because once the material benefits start to crumble, right, or even relatively subside, people start to lose faith in democracy, which is what we see today, right? The moment the West starts to feel that, oh, authoritarian China is relatively rising and we seem to be relatively becoming poorer, oh, now people are not going to like democracy anymore, right? So that creates a great deal of insecurity, right? And fear and confusion. But actually, let's just always come back to the fact that the reason why we should embrace and do our best to maintain democracy is for its intrinsic benefits, right? The fact that you can give people freedom of expression and speech, that you can have a thriving civil society, you can have checks on absolute power, you can empower different groups, particularly the marginalized in society. We embrace democracy for these reasons. Does that democracy then lead to wealth and power? In fact, the statistical evidence tells us there's no statistically significant relationship between the two. Now, that doesn't mean that democracy doesn't have growth benefits. What it means is that in order to have wealth, power, and status, in addition to democracy, you need many other things, right? You need all the stars to line up. And it is also possible in some instances, like in China, where an authoritarian government can approximate some qualities of democracy, right? Like they're competitive, they're accountable, they're meritocratic, and therefore they can function in some partial way, almost like a democracy, right? And therefore can still have benefits of growth. So I think we need to distinguish between the intrinsic and extrinsic benefits of democracy. And we need to ask ourselves an honest question. Which one do you care more about? Do you really care more about democracy, or you care more about prosperity? And they may or may not always go together.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful way of framing the question. I do want to turn now, though, to the crisis of democracy in the West, which is something you touched upon 2 questions ago. Donald Trump was convicted. He is the front runner, arguably the front runner in a race between 2 octogenarians in election, so to speak. So I guess my question here, Yuen Yuen, is what do you see to be the roots of the malaise today in America, and what's gone wrong with American democracy?
I believe he is probably the first person to be convicted, right, of a crime and be a presidential nominee at the same time. That is truly unprecedented. If he wins the presidency this year, oh my goodness, I can't wrap my head around that. It is not just upending our expectations about American democracy, it is upending the global order, right? Which like it or not, has long been premised on an understanding that in a democracy you have, first of all, you must respect the peaceful transition of power, which is something that Donald Trump has challenged. How did America arrive at its problems today? I think that we might say that it's a combination of underlying social economic problems that have long been in the making, right? Since one might say the beginnings of neoliberalism in America, where inequality steadily began to build up. I think most people forget that economic inequality necessarily translates into political inequality, right? So that has been building up over time to the current point today where there is an electorate who is fed up, right, with the political system, which is perceived as rigged, right? The voters want to be heard. They want to vent their anger, and so Donald Trump has very skillfully leveraged that sentiment. I think that's one part of it. And then another part of it is that you also have technology. I think we need to acknowledge the extent to which the advent of the internet and social media has just really transformed influence in a way we still don't completely understand, right? And it's not just about Donald Trump's tweets, but I think that it's also about polarization and amplifying negative emotions in particular. When I go on social media and I read the comments that people write, both about Biden and by Trump, right? Any candidate that's on the other side, I truly am just shocked at the amount of viciousness, right? I mean, I can understand that if you are in one political party, you don't like the other political party, but that's very different from, I wish this person dead, right? I want him to suffer in hell. I mean, that's very different, right? And I think we haven't quite come to terms with how the extent to which platforms, technology have really changed us as individuals and possibly amplified our worst sides more than our better sides. Now, in addition to that, I'm omitting many other things like racial tensions in the United States, which is always a big theme, and so on and so forth. But these are the two factors that definitely come to my mind immediately. I think even among academics, people tend to see Trump, at least the people who are not his supporters, tend to think that the problem is about Trump. I don't see it that way. I think he's an expression of a whole set of conditions that made him possible. And I really do think Trump is an emergent phenomenon. He emerged as a result of the interaction of both underlying long-standing factors as well as more recent ones.
We're coming up to the end of our interview. We're nearing the end here, but I want to conclude this terrific discussion by inviting you to comment on the present state of Sino-American relations. You know, you're in Johns Hopkins. You're a highly decorated and well-recognized academic with profound insights on China, the economy at large. But you're also right next to the heartland of US politics. Are you optimistic about the ability of the US and China, the two largest national economies in the world presently, modus vivendi through which they can co-manage their differences and disagreements? Or are you less than hopeful?
I am optimistic to the extent that I believe leaders on both sides do not want conflict. I think that's clear, and they have made that clear to each other. So that is a point of optimism, right? And I think both sides understand that they don't want to have war. They do not want to have conflict, but they will compete for the long term, right? Indefinitely. I do not know when it will end or if it will ever end. but that competition is not going to end. Right? So that gives me some optimism. The part that worries me a great deal is that below the leadership and the policy elites who are aware of the devastating cost of conflict, society thinks a very different way, right? And society, I think it's very easily influenced by elite discourse that says China is an existential threat, for instance. Sometimes politicians say these things, maybe because they somewhat believe in it, but often because they have to say it, right, to appear tough to their voters and so on. But what is often forgotten is that voters take it really seriously, right? And so the level of politicization about China, as I see in social media in particular, has reached, I think, almost a farcical level, right? Even what used to be technical topics like industrial policies, subsidies, have become super sensitive, right? And when China does industrial policy, which, by the way, the US does exactly the same thing, China is portrayed as evil, right? As like uniquely aggressive and mercantilist, right? For pursuing industrial policy. And the problem with this rhetoric is not just the hypocrisy and the double standards. My worry is that when you keep repeating these narratives, the millions of Americans who consume them start to truly believe that China is a mortal enemy rather than just a competitor, right? And the analogy I would give is, you know, we all love watching sports competition, whether it's football or basketball, right? We enjoy the feeling of cheering for our team and booing against the other team. But imagine if you have a sports competition where you truly believe that the players on the other side are evil people. That's very different, right? That's no longer just about booing or having a game or about tribalism. You're really setting up the organic social conditions for the kind of conflict we saw in World War I and World War II. So I think we really, if we do not want to have conflict, we need to look beyond the leadership and at the level of society and realize the amount of toxic we are pouring into the minds of people.
Well, thank you so much, Yuen Yuen. What certainly happened today, you know, in our conversation was the opposite. It was truly refreshing, a breath of fresh air. Thank you so very much for your time again.
Thank you very much. It was such a pleasure.
It truly